The Gambia became the third African country to withdraw from the International Criminal Court following similar decisions from South Africa and Burundi, who abandoned the Hague-based tribunal, with Kenya also set to begin moves to exit the institution. However, a move to leave the 124-member court takes 1 year to take effect after a notice is formally received by the United Nations Secretary General. To discuss the wider implications for Africa, my guests are Olufunke Adekoya, a senior advocate of Nigeria and partner and head of dispute resolutions practice at AELEX. And from Johannesburg, we have Rod Alence, associate professor at Wits University. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is a very interesting conversation. I want to start with you, Rod. And we've seen some interesting headlines around this story, and maybe I should just put it out there. Is this the beginning of the end of the ICC as you see it? What's your perspective on the recent developments?
I think that really the genie can't be put back in the bottle. The ICC was created really as a response to growing pressure on the international community to deal with these cases of gross human rights abuses like genocide and crimes against humanity. And the ICC was, and the Rome Statute were really an attempt to put that within a multilateral framework. Even if you were to take away the ICC, you would still have the need for some kind of institution to fulfill that function. And I think with this sort of 1 year gap, I think there are still issues in terms of parliamentary ratification and other kinds of formalities that there's still time for some rethinking to go into this process.
Maybe I should pose the same question to you. What's your perspective on these developments? Do you think the ICC can come out better from this?
No, I don't think so. I don't think the genie can go back into the bottle. I think it is the end of the road for the ICC. I think there's been too much built-up animosity by various African countries feeling that they have been unduly targeted.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be an international organization. It's supposed to be an international court. It seems to have focused all its energy on one particular continent, as if there are no gross abuses of human rights in other parts of the world.
Right.
So I really think that, I know there was an attempt at an AU, the recent AU meeting, to say everybody in the AU should leave. That didn't go through. If countries start leaving and giving these information one by one and giving notifications, then I think there might be a subsequent AU meeting where the AU would take a decision that anyone who wants to leave is free to leave. And then I think we'd see a mass exodus.
Right. Rod, are you expecting more countries to leave the ICC?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that there probably will be a few at least. There have been some countries also coming out on the other, African countries coming out on the other side to reaffirm that they will stay. I think that there's a lot of political heat built up around the ICC at the moment, but when you kind of scratch the surface a little bit more deeply, I mean, a lot's been made out of the fact that 9 out of the 10 investigations that have been undertaken by the ICC have been in African countries. But out of those 9, 6 have actually been initiated or referred by the government of the country that was where the investigation was going to take place, which only leaves sort of 3 kind of problem cases, which are Libya, Sudan, Darfur, and Kenya, where that's not the case. And I think a lot of the heat has really built up around the Kenyan case and the Sudan case. But if you look more broadly at the work that the ICC has been doing, it's not a perfect institution. But like I said, I mean, I do think whether it's the ICC or something else that replaces it, there's going to be a need for some kind of multilateral body to look at these kinds of cases.
Right. Well, Funke, what's the option or the alternative, if I can use that phrase, to the ICC? Before the ICC, we've seen issues like crimes against humanity and genocide and so forth being somewhat localized and treated in the areas that these crimes were committed. Do you think we're likely to move back to that, or could there be potentially, say, a regional approach to addressing these issues?
I'm not sure whether I think a regional approach would be the best approach, because if we look at what's happening at the moment, the regional approach is likely to be an African Union court.
Right.
And I'm not sure whether there is that much incentive within the African Union for them to want to police themselves. They're still doing peer review of governments, and we still haven't seen where that is taking us to. So I think that perhaps if the genie is truly out of the bottle, and the ICC is on its way out in terms of a global body, then we'll probably go back to having one-offs. International Criminal Court for Rwanda, International Criminal Court for, and have those type of things.
Right.
And perhaps that may actually be the answer, because if there is gross international human rights abuse, then perhaps the best thing is actually to have a special panel set up to deal with those instances.
Right. Rod, do you agree with Funke's perspective on this point?
Well, I mean, if you look to one of the high-profile cases before the ICC was created was the Pinochet case, the former dictator of Chile, who was indicted by a Spanish court, I believe, while he was getting medical treatment in the UK and was extradited. So the idea that these things would only be handled in the home country, I mean, I think that the international norms around these kinds of gross human rights abuses and the limits of sovereignty in providing absolute protection to people who are accused of them, I think makes it unlikely that we'd go back to a kind of purely national setting where everything is necessarily handled within the individual country where the abuses take place. That being said, I mean, the ICC system enshrines this principle of complementarity, that it's only intended to be there where the national judicial system or security system fails to address the issues. I mean, for example, in Kenya, the ICC prosecution was only initiated after there had been a commission of inquiry within Kenya, and the government was not willing to act on the recommendations of that commission. So it's not that the ICC is running around trying to police the world, but it's trying to look at the gross human rights abuse cases where it's clear that the domestic system is failing.
Do you want to comment on that view that the ICC is it supposed to, or it's perceived to be policing the world?
It's definitely not policing the world. It's definitely policing Africa. There were gross human rights abuses in Libya. Nothing came out of it. I know that the United States signed the Treaty of Rome, didn't ratify it. So as far as they're concerned, no American soldier, no matter what atrocities were committed in the Middle East, can go to the ICC. But the ICC didn't even make a statement. And the world community, which supposedly supports the ICC, didn't even make a statement and say, if not for the fact that these people actually ought to be brought to the ICC for trial. And perhaps if the ICC really were a global body, policing everyone, we wouldn't have Guantanamo Bay.
Rod, do you want to respond to that point?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the areas where people need to, where there'll need to be some creative thinking about how to go forward. The UN system, from its foundation, is a very uneasy, awkward fusion of the principle of sovereign equality, the principle of one state, one vote, and great power politics, which is where we get these 5 countries that have vetoes in the UN Security Council. And so what that means is that there are big sections of the world where one of those 5 major powers is actually unwilling to push for a referral to the ICC. So for example, Syria came up, but Russia and China vetoed that. Other countries haven't even come up at the Security Council level, probably based on the expectation that it would never fly. I mean, we don't see anything about North Korea, we don't see anything about Israel-Palestine, we don't see anything about Chechnya. So to me, really, the problem is not so much that the ICC is overly focused on Africa, it's that too many other gross human rights abuses are kind of, investigations are blocked, at least at the Security Council level, by the veto power.
Interesting points you're making there.
So we're not all equal under the law.
Apparently, judging by what we're seeing, obviously. But for me, what concerns me around this is what are the implications of this for Africa in terms of making sure that crimes committed in Africa are brought to justice. If we look at different countries, and there's a sense that we still need some institution outside the country as a fallback institution.
I agree with
if things don't work out internally.
I
so
agree with you.
If this development continues, what is the alternative for Africa in your view?
I think we'll go back to international criminal tribunals. Nature abhors a vacuum. And definitely, I don't think it's a matter for a national court. I think in issues where there have been gross international rights abuses, it's probably been due to a failure of the judicial system within the country, or a refusal of the powers that be to submit these issues to the judicial system. So I think that we'll go back to a case-by-case basis where we'll have international criminal tribunals.
Right. Rod, do you want to respond to that point too?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, if the ICC falls away, that would be one of the ways that it could go, and the African Union is trying to talk about.
But you don't think it's going to fall away, right?
I think all bets are off this week. There's going to be a period of time where I think there's going to be some serious discussion. So I can't really, you know, predict what's going to happen in the future. But I mean, I think that the debate, and this is partly because it's what gets the politicians up in arms, are these cases of sitting presidents or presidential candidates being indicted by the ICC. Like I said, out of the cases within Africa, 6 of the 9 have actually been referred by the government in which the investigation would take place. So, for example, Mali initiated a process regarding the Al-Qaeda affiliated rebels in northern Mali. Uganda, which has been a big critic of the ICC recently, actually initiated a case against the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda. So those are actually more the normal cases where, you know, in the sense that there have been more of them than the high-profile cases of like Sudan and Kenya, where it's actually been African governments saying to a multilateral body, we're having trouble coping with the problem of these gross human rights abuses, and we need assistance. So I think we need to look at the big picture of all the range of different kinds of cases that have come through.
All right, we have to take a break now. We'll continue this conversation. After that, I've been speaking to Olufunke Adekoya, Senior Advocate of Nigeria and Partner and Head of Dispute Resolution Practice at AELEX and Rod Alence, Associate Professor at Wits University. Welcome back to our conversation around the withdrawal of African countries from the International Criminal Court. My guests are Olufunke Adekoya, Senior Advocate of Nigeria and Partner and Head of Dispute Resolution Practice at AELEX, and Rod Alence, Associate Professor at Wits University. Afuke, I want to bring this point. Research suggests that prosecutions of leaders in the ICC make many of these dictators less likely to peacefully step down. That has been a view expressed, and I just want to get your thoughts on what some are suggesting are some of the unintended consequences of the ICC.
I haven't really given that a thought, but it is a distinct possibility.
Yeah.
What I have thought about is the fact that with a large number of so-called democratic governments, where we actually have presidents or heads of states who are purportedly democratically elected, but everybody knows that they're actually despotic dictatorship governments. I think that is in fact what is going to trigger the urge to move out of the ICC, because as they become more and more repressive and their citizens become more and more restive, the fear of being taken to the ICC, they actually want to say, we're going to leave the ICC, we're going to leave the ICC. As to whether the present heads of states are actually looking at a I'm not sure there are too many African heads of state who are actually looking at a post-government position and what could happen to them. I think they're actually looking at, I don't want to be dragged to the ICC, so we'd probably get out of it.
Right.
And with this impetus, that's why I think it started.
Okay, Rod, let me get your perspective on this, the influence of the ICC on leaders in Africa. What's your view on that point?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with the premise that it creates political challenges when you have a head of state who maybe has charges against him that he's going to be even less likely to want to step down voluntarily, and that makes it difficult to make a transition to a democratic or a more democratic kind of system. So I think that that is a concern that needs to, will need to be factored in. I don't think, given the way that international norms about humanitarian intervention and sort of cracking down on gross human rights abuses, I don't think that will be able to hold up as a reason not to push forward. But if we go back to like the case of Pinochet in Chile, he was there was a domestic political settlement where he got a degree of immunity out of that process in return for stepping down. And there was a big fear when he traveled internationally and other countries tried to press charges against him, that this was somehow interfering with the domestic politics of Chile, because that had been part of sort of a peace deal that had stabilized the country. And so he got kind of caught because he was given immunity under one system, and then under the other system he was he was almost brought to trial.
Well, but let's talk about the sovereignty of states and what the ICC means for that. To what extent that challenges the sovereignty of a nation and the people of those of the country to be able to resolve their matters by themselves. Do you think the ICC kinds of constrain sovereignty in any way, in your view?
Well, to the extent to which the jurisdiction of the ICC impacts upon the sovereignty of a state, I don't think it's an issue, because the country itself gave up that level of sovereignty when it signed on to the Treaty of Rome. In the same way as in which countries enter into commercial contracts, they give up their sovereignty because they've gone into a commercial arena. Right. So I think that sovereignty really is not an issue. It's being raised now only because it seems as if there's a focus on Africa, and the rest of the world either don't have these gross abuses that will raise international eyebrows. And as Rod said, I think also there's the feeling of we're not all equal under the law. The ICC works for African countries, but for other areas, you have members who have veto powers killing it at the United Nations level, so it doesn't even go to the ICC. So I think that's the issue.
Rod, it seems we're not all equal. Your perspective on this point?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there is one mechanism, if I'm correct on the law here, that a country that's not a signatory to the ICC, charges can still be advanced, but only through the Security Council mechanism. So there is some degree to which that can happen anyway. But what we've seen is actually the Security Council has been extremely ineffective. There have only been the two cases where they've been able to push for something. But yeah, I mean, I would agree that there's a voluntary element to entering into the ICC, and then you need to kind of take the consequences of that. I mean, I think that's where South Africa was kind of frustrated with the visit of President al-Bashir, in that they had signed on, and that involved obligations to extradite if he were to come to the country, and it's happened in a couple other countries as well. And that became quite awkward diplomatically.
All right. And Rod, if I can stay with you, and just maybe an opportunity to just think through the reasons why the countries who are looking to move out now are doing so. So we have South Africa, we have Burundi, more recently Gambia and Kenya. If we look at each country's situation case by case, what would you say are the big takeaways or lessons here that can perhaps guide reforms in terms of the way the ICC is supposed to function in the future?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think the Kenyan objection has been, well established and is related to the charges which have been withdrawn subsequently or haven't been followed up on Uhuru Kenyatta and others. I think Burundi, there have been some preliminary, I don't think they call it investigation, but examination, which can be kind of a primary first step towards a formal investigation about atrocities in Burundi. And what Burundi did actually even before South Africa was to go to parliament and pass, have a vote to say that they wanted to get out. Now the tricky thing for Burundi is even if they leave, even if they leave, anything that happened while they were still signatory to the Rome Statute will still, they don't kind of get grandfathered out of that. They're still liable for that. And I think Gambia is an interesting one because the government, I think, maybe might feel somewhat vulnerable about the ICC given the nature of the regime. At the same time, the chief prosecutor at the ICC currently is a Gambian. So it's an interesting case. I think South Africa, it's been kind of a tricky diplomatic balancing act, given that there are a few countries in the continent that are quite strongly opposed to the ICC and others that aren't. But given South Africa's history and given its kind of association with the UN and with human rights and all these kinds of issues, it's unfortunate that when as soon as South Africa sends a signal that it's okay to leave, that we get this kind of flood of other countries thinking that that this is a signal that they can remove themselves.
I want you to also reflect on this point. The countries moving out, do they have a case at all? And
I can understand. I mean, Kenya is quite clear. Gambia, I think it might be a preemptive strike. There are issues as to crackdowns within the Gambia. And perhaps there's a feeling that I better just get out of this system before it comes to catch up with me. South Africa, I can understand the dilemma. The feeling that, look, we have a person who's protected by diplomatic immunity. At the same time, we've signed on to some sort of an agreement that says you must do this if this happens. I think as of today, there's still a fair number of countries, Nigeria inclusive, which are saying, no, the International Criminal Court is here to stay, we support it, we think it is the best for Africa. Whether that group of countries will be sufficient to stem those who are saying, if it's okay for South Africa to leave, then it's okay for us to leave, I think it's something that we're going to have to wait and see. But I personally, I'm not holding my breath. I think that I'm going to be proved wrong. I hope I'm proved wrong. But I tend to think that it's on its way out.
Well, I think maybe it's also an opportunity to just reflect on the legal systems of the individual countries in Africa and to what extent you will say they have developed and they are equipped enough to, or should I say not necessarily equipped, but independent enough to give judgments on issues when we have to do that. Because at the end of the day, if the local systems work, there's really no need for the ICC. Yeah. Can you just reflect on how things are progressing? In Nigeria, you could say the judiciary is currently on trial with what is going on with the corruption crackdown.
True. I think that it's clear that the fact that there is an international criminal court does mean that the cases that are coming there, the countries from which they are coming are not judicially equipped, either for issues of political sensitivity or perhaps even just internal capacity to deal with the level of issues that have brought it to an international level. Because it's not every abuse of human rights that goes to the criminal court. It has to be on a massive scale, which either means that it's supported by executive action or it's supported by popular action, such that the judiciary is either caught in the middle, doesn't have the equipment, doesn't have the capacity, or possibly isn't supported with enough political will. And my view is that for countries who want to say we can handle our issues ourselves, we don't need an international criminal court. Perhaps it's an opportunity for those countries to look back and actually strengthen their own internal judicial systems, such that they could deal with such issues.
Rod, as we begin to round up, maybe your final thoughts on the internal judicial systems of African countries.
Yeah, well, I mean, talking to two people who are based in Nigeria, I mean, I think Nigeria has referred the Boko Haram matter, and one of the things that's interesting is they've accepted also that preliminary investigation, not quite a formal investigation yet, would include the Nigerian military as well. So that actually seems like a quite promising sign from Nigeria in support of the ICC. But in terms of South Africa, I think one thing that's sort of fallen through the cracks is that the story's not over yet. The decision was made only at ministerial cabinet level, so it's at this point an executive decision, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but there's a lot of discussion that technically this is going to have to go through Parliament and might even have to go through the Constitutional Court, which is quite prescriptive on human rights issues in South Africa. So I don't think that the announcement the other day was the end of the story. So I think that there's going to be more in South Africa. Given the political turbulence in general in the country, I think it's really hard to predict how this will work out. So that's one of the reasons why I think there's still a lot of uncertainty what the prognosis looks like a year or so down the line.
We have to leave it there. Very interesting conversation. Many thanks to my guest, Olufunke Adekoya, Senior Advocate of Nigeria, as well as Partner and Head of Dispute Resolution Practice at AELEX, and Rod Alence, Associate Professor at Wits University.